Okay, so hi, I think I can get started. So thanks for coming. And so hi, my name is Leah. I'm a computational biologist, and generally I study how the bacteria in our gut impact our health. And so one of the ways in which I usually do this is I take the view of our gut microbial community as a single system or a network. And the idea here is that I can understand things about the function of gut microbes as a system that I can't necessarily resolve if I were just to study individual components. And so I've titled the talk Finding the Narrative in Networks because I think it provides a really good summary of my broad goals. And so for today, my goals are to first kind of speak to identify how we can identify some of the systems that are all around us as complex networks, and to give some examples. I then want to talk about how you can use network science and these network science measures to get a sense of to study systems better and to understand them. And lastly, I want to provide some examples and enable anyone who wants the opportunity to analyze and interpret some of these networks using Python. And a broader goal of this is hopefully for you guys to take away from this talk is that just to see the utility of using this kind of systems thinking and network analysis for a wide variety of problems. And so just to start off, I'm just going to briefly define some network terms I want us all to share, and to give some examples of networks. And so to start off, so what is a network? And so very simply, a network is a collection of points connected by lines in pairs. And as a concept in math, a network is often also referred to as a graph. And so I'm going to go back between calling a network a graph and calling a network a network. I'm also going to, for my purposes, these points, I'm going to refer to them as nodes, and these lines, I'm going to refer to them as edges. Now, depending on where you're coming from, you may be used to nodes being called vertices or actors, and the edges be called links or bonds or ties. The key takeaway here is that for anything that you can think of where it exists as a collection of things or points or components that are linked, these things can be studied and represented as networks, and I think, and hopefully you'll see by the end of this that there's a lot to gain when you do this. And so what are some examples of networks? And so one type of network that you see a lot are these technological networks. And so these are things like the internet. When you can think of the internet as a global network of connections that are maybe they're electrical, they're wireless, they're optical, and they're connecting computers and other information systems together. Another type of network that tends to be studied using network analysis a lot are these social networks. And so these are networks where the nodes are usually people, and the connections usually represent some sort of relationship like friendship or relatedness. A third type of network that we tend to see and study a lot are information networks. And so these are networks like email communication or the World Wide Web, where the nodes are the web pages, and then the edges are the hyperlinks that connect them. And lastly, the type of network that I tend to focus on the most are these biological networks. And so these are things like all the metabolic reactions that are happening inside your body, inside cells, or say the connections between brain cells in your brain, or just a food web, and so you have connections between species. And so in all of these examples, what's interesting is that the patterns of nodes and edges in the networks can tell you something about how the overall network behaves. And what we're finding and what we're learning about now is that for fields where network analysis has been used a lot, regardless of whether these same things have been studied in other fields, once you understand these patterns, you can apply them broadly. And just to give you one sneak peek, one example of this, there's been a lot of use of network analysis in ecology, and now there's more interest in applying this to the study of financial systems. And so to tell you a quick story, this is a quote from a paper that came out in Nature in 2008, and how this paper came about is that a group of scientists, they were ecologists, in 2006, they were invited to this meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to talk about systemic risk. And so they went to this meeting, they learned a lot about our financial systems and how they worked, and then they wrote this paper and they said, hey, you know what, we're ecologists, and when we study financial systems, we notice that they tend to be overconnected through things like subprime loans and other measures. And so from our perspective, when we look at something like, say, a food web, a healthy, stable food web is usually something where all nodes have very sparse connections, right? And so when you have an overconnected food web, that's usually a sign that it's on the brinks of collapse. And so they said, look, we're not in charge of financial systems, but we would be worried because given the overconnected structure of these systems, it's an indicator to us that it's not going to respond well, it's not going to be very robust to a shock to the system. And so we know what happened later in 2008. Markets did collapse. And now there's a lot of interest, and I should also point out here that there are definitely other signs that you can get without using network analysis that there were trouble. But I think what's important and what's really cool about this to me is that it shows how you can use these high-level properties and structures of a network to gain really insightful information. And so now there's a lot of use, people thinking about how you can use network analysis to understand the stability and robustness of financial systems. And so now I'd like to turn to the network measures that I want to focus on for today. And so I'm going to focus on two in particular. So there's this idea of centrality. And so this is a way that you can kind of get at questions of, well, what nodes are the most important in a network? And another idea that I'd like to talk about briefly is this idea of modularity. And so you can think of this as a way to understand, well, where are the communities? What are the natural subdivisions within our network? And so as you can imagine, there are many different ways that you kind of think of, well, how is a node important? And how is a node important? And so I just want to talk about three. And so when you try to compute degree centrality, what you're saying essentially is that important nodes are nodes that are connected to have the most edges. And so to define this, just a normalized version is you're counting up how many edges a particular node has, and you're normalizing that by the total number of nodes minus 1. Another way to think about node importance is closeness centrality. And so by this measure, you're saying important nodes are nodes that are close to the most other nodes. And so to think about this, you kind of have to have a sense of distance within a network. And so in a network, the distance between two nodes is the shortest past the amount of edges that you have to take to get from one node to the other. And so to compute closeness centrality, you're essentially looking at the ratio of, again, the total nodes over n, total number of nodes minus 1, over the sum of all nodes in the network and the distance between your node of interest and all other nodes in that network. And lastly, another measure of centrality that I want to think about is this idea of betweenness centrality. And so in this idea, important nodes are the ones that connect the most other nodes to each other. Right? And so to compute this, what you're looking for, so this value sigma here is really just saying for any pair of nodes, nodes S and T, what you're first calculating is you're calculating how many shortest paths exist between those nodes, so how many ways can you get from S to T? And then you're also looking at, well, how many of those shortest paths involves going through N? And then you use that to get a sense of node importance based on betweenness centrality. And lastly, to define modularity, so again, this is a way of looking at the natural subdivisions in your graph. And so what you want to do here is, for nodes, you want to find a way to measure how many nodes are more similar to each other than they are to other nodes. And so they should be highly interconnected and sparsely intraconnected and sparsely interconnected. And the one method that I'm going to show you of calculating modularity is simply a method where all nodes start off as their own community, and then you randomly join nodes together until you can no longer improve the modularity score, so how closely connected they are, by moving nodes around. And so now just switching into putting this into practice. And so there are a lot of tools that are out there. Again, these slides will also be at this repository if you're interested in checking these out. I'm just going to provide some quick examples. I'd like to note that there's a lot to study with network analysis, and so this is going to be a very broad overview, but just in terms of the tools that we're going to use to do this, I'm going to use NetworkX. It's a Python package for analyzing complex networks. And this other GitHub user linked here, I guess, did a pretty good job of compiling a lot of other software packages and tools that you can use regardless of language. He also linked to a large number of resources, books, tutorials that are worth checking out if you're interested in network analysis. So we're also going to use Viz.js to Jupyter. So Viz.js is a JavaScript library usually used for visualizing networks in the browser. Viz.js to Jupyter is a nice Python module that enables you to visualize these in your Jupyter notebooks. And lastly, I'm going to use Python iGraph. It's another network package that I like in Python. And so you'll also need these dependencies, but this information is, again, in the GitHub repository if you're interested in looking at it. And so just to take you what we would go through if we were looking through the network. And so I'm importing these Python libraries. And so in Network X, you can either upload your own graph or you can create a graph. And so just to get everyone used to the basic functionality, if I were to create a graph, I would use the graph class here, call it in, add in my edges. In this case, I'm creating a graph and assigning these weights and plotting it. Oh, sorry, I'm plotting it. And you can see you just get a simple undirected graph. And I say it's undirected because I'm assuming that all the connections are bidirectional, and so there's no direction. And so you can imagine there are cases where you have a directed graph, like in a metabolic network where the enzyme, the reaction only goes in one direction and you can't take it backwards. And so in that case, and that's also the case for something like a food web. And so if I wanted to recreate this food web as a graph, I would make it so that the nodes are these species, and then the direction of the arrows is direction of the energy flow. And so since sharks eat sea otters, the arrow would be going from the sea otter to the shark. And so in this directed graph, I'm going to use a directed graph class, call in the edges. And in this case, the order that you put it in matters because the direction's going from left to right. You plot that. And so when you plot this in Network X, it's I guess what I don't like about it is it doesn't actually give you an actual arrow. Instead, the direction is indicated by this bar. When we use Viz.js to Jupyter, this is in Python iGraph. These are packages where visually you can make things look nicer. And so this last final class that I want to talk about is a multi-graph. And so you can imagine you can have a network where there are multiple edge relationships that you want to show. And so if you're using, you can use the multi-graph class and say this time I'm adding another attribute where I want to talk about there's some other relationship that I think is interesting, plotting that, and then drawing it. And it looks the same. If I want to, say, pull out the attributes for a particular pair, I just use the edge function, and that gets out. Or if I want to pull out the attributes for everything, I'll just use the edges function, and that gets out. And so with this basic things in mind, I want to now turn to analyzing actual data sets. And so this first data set that I want to look at is a bacterial metabolic network. And so in this case, the nodes are enzymes that catalyze reactions, and it's directed. And so why might I want to do this using network analysis? And so for the bacteria that we're going to look at, it's a species called Klebsiella thuringiena. It's found in the soil. It's also found in your gut to a small extent. And the key thing to know about it is that sometimes it can convert environmental toxins into compounds that are toxic to humans. And so for species like Klebsiella thuringiena or other bugs that we might think are pathogenic or toxic, sometimes scientists want to do something where you target that bug specifically without targeting everything else, right? Because something like antibiotics, you clear out your whole system, you clear out things that are helpful. And so one way to do this is to identify nodes or enzymes that can, that by targeting them, you can inhibit the growth of the bacteria. And so this is one way where you would ask, well, what nodes are most important for the growth? And so this becomes a centrality question. And so again, reading in the graph, computing these centrality measures, degree, closeness, betweenness. And this time I'm using in Viz.js to Jupyter. And so this is just for me assigning node attribute colors. And so I'm coloring the graph by betweenness centrality. I'm using a matplotlib color map. Sorry, let me go back here. And then just assigning the layout to the function. In Network X, there are a variety of different algorithms that you can use to lay out your graph, and I would encourage you to look at the documentation if you're interested in that. Here, I'm just setting the node attributes. I want the node size to correlate with the betweenness centrality score, and so I'm setting that up here. Outlining the edge attributes and setting up the network styles. And so just things like node color, background. And so here's what the network looks like. And so again, bigger nodes are ones with higher betweenness centrality scores. And so by what I've told you earlier about betweenness centrality, these are nodes that connect more, that have more control over a network because they connect more other nodes together. And so you can imagine that, okay, this is my first step. Now I'm going to make a list of all of these nodes, and I'm going to see, well, can I knock these nodes out? Is this an enzyme that humans have? Would I also be targeting and impacting the health of human enzymes, or is this something specific to bacteria where I can target it? And so this is just one example of how you might use this. The second data set that I want to look at is one of dolphins. And so a scientist, David Luceau, who's a marine biologist, for 7 years, he followed around a group of bottlenose dolphins, and through ways that you can check out in his paper, was able to figure out who was friends with whom. Dolphins are very social. And so one of the questions that they asked, well, which dolphins are most important for social cohesion? And so again, this is an example where it's a centrality question. I want to know which nodes are most important. And so here I'm just reading in the data and drawing it first using network X, and then computing the centrality measures. And so what's also interesting about this is, again, the measure that you choose really shapes your measure of importance, I guess, shapes your outcome. And so by degree centrality, I'm simply computing it and sorting the dictionary so that I can find the value with the greatest score and printing that out. And the ID associated with that is number 14. By closeness centrality, so I'm doing the same thing. I'm computing the closeness centrality and then sorting it to find the max value. And again, in closeness centrality, the most important one needs to be the ID associated with 36. I do this for betweenness centrality as well. And again, when I sort this, the most important one seems to be ID with 36 again. And so what's interesting, and this is the visualization process again. And so what's interesting is that when you look at this network, so node SN100, they also got named, is node 36. And what's interesting about this study is that 2 years into the study, SN100 actually just left the community. He came back, but he left for a while. And when he left, the two groups this community actually split off into two groups. And so what this tells you is that these measures, these ideas of understanding who's important in social cohesion can actually tell you who's important to keeping the network together. And so this, one more example that really gets at this, and I'll go through this a bit more quickly, is an example of a human social network. And so with the karate club. And in this example, taken in the 70s, a social scientist followed around this karate club. And the key things that you need to close, that they were happy, then there was a conflict about pricing, and the karate club split into two groups. And so using this idea of modularity, and I'm just computing this using Python iGraph. And so here I'm just loading in the network and then using the summary feature to get ideas to just list all the attributes. So it's just the ID, it's undirected, 34 nodes, 78 edges. And then I'm using this community detection algorithm to figure out, well, okay, you have this conflict. How do I think these communities are going to split? And by this algorithm, I would predict that the community split off into these 4 groups. And so since we have this data and we know how they split, we know that in actuality, I guess if you were to join the red and the green and the yellow and the blue, that would actually tell you how the communities actually split. And so the 2 key things about this is, one, it tells you that you can use these ideas of modularity and centrality to gain answers to real-world problems within the network. And then specific to this network, I think what's interesting about this is that people, I guess friendship really matters. And so people within these groups may have had different ideas about whether to charge more and less, but that didn't seem to matter. At the end of the day, when it was time to close the network, people chose to just go with their friends regardless of what they thought about pricing. And so I think that's a good lesson to learn as well. And so really briefly, I'd just like to note that there are alternatives ways to represent the network if I have more time. I guess for really large networks, I think there are some programs written in C++ that are better for dealing with large networks. A lot of what I talked about is just really focusing on static networks, so assuming that the nodes don't disappear and the edges stay the same. That's not always the case. Networks are dynamical systems, and there are interesting ways to think of them and try to analyze them as such. There are additional resources which will be up on the GitHub repository. And just to close, I like to go back to this question, well, why are networks interesting? Is that I hope what I've shown is that there are a lot of systems where or systems where thinking them as complex systems and representing them as networks can really be useful and tell you and give you more insights into them. And so this idea, this process of identifying a complex system, representing it as a network, investigating it, understanding, learning about its behavior, and asking more questions or taking actions is hopefully something you consider is a really good way to understand behavior. And so I'll wrap up there because I'm running low on time and take any questions. Do you have a question?
It's kind of a science question.
Okay.
I'd really love to know anything you can tell us about networks in the gut bacteria.
Yeah. And so I guess, and I'll try to keep this quick. And so I, like I said, I studied the bacteria in the gut microbiome. And I think what people are learning, I was talking to some people about this at lunch, is that you can basically find an association between a gut microbe and some disease for everything. And so you have to go beyond association studies to really get an understanding of what's going on. And so when you take this review of looking at gut microbes as a system, one things that we have learned is that, okay, well, maybe in disease-wise, specific microbes may not matter, but if you look at the pattern, it seems like you have microbes that are involved in, that are enriched in enzymes involved in like carbohydrate metabolism that seem to be associated with obesity. And so you get into patterns like that when you take this systems approach. And so that's one of the ways in which I think it's really interesting. Any other questions? Hi. So those were enzymes, right? So it was one. So this was just one genome, and so the nodes are different enzymes. So you can imagine in a pathway you have enzyme 1 metabolizes a substrate, and then enzyme 2 uses that substrate for something else, and so that's how you get all those connections. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Thank you.